the environment in general. We're here to talk to you a little bit too about science and uncertainty, and about the tensions between economic growth and natural resource use, and maybe a little bit about how we cover these things in the media. So, this is kind of a small group, but I'm going to do this anyway. I wasn't sure that I would, but if you'll bear with me, I'm going to ask you to do something that seems a little bit hokey. But there's a point. I promise there's a point. And it's something that I'm borrowing from a fellow named Ray Anderson, which some of you may have heard of. He's the founder of a company called Interphase Carpet, which is the world's largest manufacturer, I believe, of modular carpeting. And he's become something of a darling among environmentalists for what he would describe as his own awakening to the notion of environmental responsibility. And I'll talk a little bit more about Mr. Anderson a bit later, but let me just try this now. So I'd like to ask everyone to kind of close your eyes and take a deep breath and imagine to yourself your most perfect place. It can be anywhere, obviously, but it should be a place where you feel utterly at peace, where you feel pure and whole, unworried and serene. I'll give you a second to focus on that. You can open your eyes. I'm going to avoid taking a poll, but I would wager that most of you, if not all of you, probably conjured a place that was outdoors. Maybe someone imagined a garage or something like that. Is the idea that we conjure something that's outdoors surprising in and of itself? Maybe not. But what it demonstrated to me when Mr. Anderson first shared that exercise with me was that no matter what we do, whether we are construction workers or computer programmers, chief executive of an oil company, or even a cynical journalist, we have some kind of hardwired connection to nature. Whether we live in a high-rise condominium or on a small farm, in a suburban housing development, we still have some connection to the natural world. I'm not suggesting that we're all deep down dyed-in-the-wool greens who would, if offered the chance, prefer to live in a tree. Most of us are more practical than that. We like our homes. We like our cars and our access to planes, trains, buses. We like having access to affordable and varied choices in food and clothing. We enjoy being able to turn on the heat when it's cold outside. We like to flip on the air conditioning when it's hot. We like having light when it's dark, and we like having our computers and our iPods and our televisions. But we also want, I think, and expect some simple things that probably showed up in your imagination of the perfect place. Things like, say, clean water and fresh air. And we all probably want to ensure that our perfect place, wherever it is, remains our perfect place. And maybe that it becomes a perfect place for someone else someday. Maybe our children, maybe our grandchildren. And I think it's here where we find the tensions that the world is increasingly confronting. Our desire, our need, really, for things like heat and light and mobility is often tugging against our need for clean air, fresh water, and enduring perfect places. In fact, for most of our history, as an industrious and engineering species, these two drives have typically been at odds. And rightly or wrongly, these conflicting desires, or what have been conflicting desires, underpin a whole slate of geopolitical tensions in which our individual and national aspirations for those things, for our clean water and our fresh air and our heat and our light and our mobility, are often at odds with aspirations of individuals and nations who align across a wide spectrum of economic development, political philosophies, and access to resources of their own. And of course, those are the tensions that are now playing out in a lot of ways of climate change. As most of you know, that's what brought together nearly 200 nations in Copenhagen in December, and the mission of that meeting was pretty simple. The nations of the world, under the auspices of the UN, were to come together and at the most fundamental level, accept and negotiate a measure of responsibility for the climate, or rather for the emissions that we collectively put into the climate, which over time appear to be contributing to higher temperatures. Those rising temperatures could, in the worst case scenarios that we hear about, cause long-lasting disruptions of whole ecosystems and economies. Now, I'm going to go down this road of the debate over global warming. As we all know, there are lots of positions on this issue. I read recently, as a matter of fact, we were just chatting about the Senate. The state Senate here has just recently passed a resolution that would ask the EPA, which recently announced plans to begin regulating greenhouse gas emissions, to pull back on those plans until climate change is proven. And that's a quote from the Salt Lake Tribune. And recent polls seem to suggest that many Americans are becoming more skeptical about global warming, or at least the degree to which it represents a problem requiring federal regulation or capping of emissions. And just why that might be is probably a result of a number of factors, but let me start by summarizing how the New York Times describes global warming, and this comes from our topics page at nytimes.com. You can find it there. A growing body of scientific evidence indicates that since 1950, the world's climate has been warming. This comes directly from the website. Primarily as a result of emissions from the unfettered burning of fossil fuels and the raising of tropical forests. Such activity adds to the atmosphere's invisible blanket of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. That conclusion has emerged through a broad body of analysis in fields as disparate as glaciology, the study of glacial formations, and palynology, which is the study of the distribution of pollen grains in lake mud. It is based on a host of assessments by the world's leading organizations of climate and earth scientists. Despite the scientific consensus on these basic conclusions, however, enormous important details remain murky. I think that's the important point to note. The murkiness involves really important questions, like how warm will it get? How quickly? How fast might sea levels rise? And are there any factors that we aren't considering that would mitigate the worst of it? These are all very tough questions, and we still, as far as I can understand it, don't have a lot of hard answers. But John Christie, a professor of atmospheric science and the director of Earth System Science at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, summarized the debate this way in a newspaper interview a few years back. He said, "It is scientifically inconceivable that after changing forests into cities, turning millions of acres into irrigated farmland, putting massive quantities of soot and dust into the air, and putting extra gases into the air, that the natural course of climate has not changed in some way." Now, reading that, I thought, well, that seems a pretty reasonable assertion. Though it's also worth noting that Mr. Christie, writing in the journal Nature earlier this month, also said this, and this is a quote, "The truth, and this is frustrating for policymakers, is that scientists' ignorance of the climate system is enormous. There is still much messy, contentious, snail-paced, and now hopefully transparent work to do." That last bit about transparency refers obviously to a recent dust-up over email messages that were either stolen or perhaps liberated, depending on your point of view, from a British climate research facility late last year, which you, I'm sure, know of as ClimateGate. The emails seem to suggest that some prominent climate scientists sought to stifle dissenting voices on the global warming question, or that they were willing to fudge data to amplify their points. I don't think there's any question that that was the case. But to date, I'm not sure that anything has emerged, either from those emails or the ongoing investigation, that undermines the general scientific consensus that the planet is getting warmer to some degree, and that human beings are contributing something to it. And it certainly has added to a growing sense of mistrust of climate science. In the end, these sorts of debates, very, very heated debates, will almost certainly continue, and as they unfold, they seem to me to be worthy of robust reportage and investigation. And given that even the most prominent scientists agree that the complexity of our climate prevents us from saying with certainty that temperatures will rise by, say, 3.1 degrees, or that sea levels will increase by X amount by some specified date, I would guess that policy decisions in every nation on this front will remain a very nuanced affair. And of course, current economic and political factors will be weighed against an uncertain future risk. After all, if we knew with absolute certainty that climate Armageddon awaited us at the stroke of midnight in the year 2020, unless we curtailed greenhouse gas emissions now, there'd be far more unanimity on how to proceed. But it seems to me unlikely that we'll ever have that kind of uncertainty. And so decisions on what to do at every level, or what not to do, become matters of calculating the risk and deciding how much insurance society wants to take out on that uncertain future. Or put another way, how much is either side willing to gamble on being wrong? And to me, as a journalist, these are much more interesting questions than whether or not the planet is warming. After all, the talks in Copenhagen did not get bogged down over issues of science, really. These were thousands of scientists, environmental advocates, national delegates, and politicians who gathered on the basic premise that global warming is an issue that does require some international attention. I remember seeing on banner screens at the opening plenary session, there was a short film, which you can find on YouTube still, that featured a young girl waking up to a living climate nightmare, and included a heat-scorched planet, menacing storms, and ultimately raging seas that swallowed up everything around her as she said, "Please, the violin horizon, help the world." Later, Connie Hedegaard, the Danish minister overseeing the negotiations, exhorted the gathering, saying, "Let's get this done. This is the time to deliver. This is the place to commit." But as the enthusiasm and pathos gave way to actual deliberations, all the familiar stumbling blocks began to emerge. Simply put, no one could really agree on just how bad things are, how bad they might get, who was to blame, who ought to pay what, and to whom in an attempt to fix things. In a nutshell, climate change pits the industrialized world, which has the financial means to adapt to a hotter planet, against poor ones demanding recompense for a problem that they did little to create. It pits prosperous countries, which became prosperous through copious use of fossil fuels, against developing economies reluctant to put a price on carbon now that it's their turn to grow. And it pits comparatively fuel-efficient and carbon-capping blocs like the European Union against the more reluctant and politically divided United States, which itself is keenly eyeing CO2-spewing trade rivals like China. And I think the outcome of the meeting obviously is well known by now. A fragmentary accord, hastily stitched together by a small group of major emitters, was put forth at the 11th hour. It was not formally adopted by the conference. It is not binding on any of the participants, and it sets no deadline for arriving at anything more formal. A deadline for submitting emissions reduction commitments over the next decade was set for the end of January, and it was mostly met. But the reduction amounts, the baseline years over which such reductions would be measured, and even the means for achieving these goals varied widely. The United States, for its part, maintained a commitment to cut emissions by something in the range of 17% by 2020 over 2005 levels, and only if Congress enacts legislation that commits to a similar goal. But thus far, there's no indication that Congress is likely to do that anytime soon. So what's the upshot of the meeting? Some say that the failure of the Copenhagen talks to produce a binding accord suggests an end to the United Nations' role as a catalyst for negotiations on this topic, and that individual countries, probably the biggest emitters, will sort out something workable on their own. Others suggest that the outcome, along with the reduction pledges submitted last month, are by themselves a victory, in that both industrialized nations and developing countries, the latter is expected to be the largest source of emissions going forward, put something, however restrained, in writing. And yet still others say that the feebleness of all those commitments will do little to stave off what could be the worst effects of climate change. And in any case, there are myriad other aspects of the Accord, too, that remain unresolved, including the question of financing for poor nations to prepare for and adapt to whatever warmer temperatures might deliver. Wealthy nations, I think, have committed about $30 billion in short-term support right now, but no long-term support, which is what developing nations want, have been agreed to. So, We have some minor and arguably very grudging movements arising out of the intense friction between national self-interest and what would seem to be a global greater good. Whether those small movements are a victory, a failure, or a waste of time and money depends, I suppose, on where you sit. But to me, they represent the sorts of environmental calculations and small movements that play out on a more local level every day, among local political leaders, among business executives, and among ordinary citizens. More and more, these actors are grappling with an array of choices and trade-offs on these fronts. What will be included on the ledger of responsibility? And what will be excluded? In the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which some of you may know, those things that we tend to exclude are called SEPs, or somebody else's problems. In business and economics, they're referred to as externalities, which my dictionary, when I looked it up, defined as side effects or consequences of an industrial or commercial activity that affects other parties without this being reflected in the cost of the goods or services involved. So for well over a century, the carbon dioxide emissions arising from the combustion of fossil fuels have been considered an externality, somebody else's problem. Now science seems to be suggesting that that might not be a sustainable position. So what do? Another example, coal extraction, particularly modern surface mining techniques. They can have profoundly negative consequences for the local environment and for the health of surrounding communities. But who pays for those impacts? Are they reflected in the price of coal? In some ways, I know this is oversimplifying, and that there are myriad factors that go into all of these questions, and that they go well beyond the environment. In this country, and indeed much of the world, we're experiencing one of the most difficult economic downturns in decades, for example, and our ledgers, our tally of what counts as our problem and what doesn't, is inevitably going to be impacted by how much additional responsibility we feel we can afford to take on. We're also entering an election cycle, and that will certainly play a role in what decisions get made, which ones don't, and when. Still, the decision by the EPA to begin regulating greenhouse gases suggests that the administration aims to push some of those climate costs onto the ledgers of big industrial polluters. The climate bill passed by the House last summer, which is now stalled in the Senate, suggests that Congress may well attempt, maybe this year, maybe next year, to put a price on carbon emissions. Meanwhile, unprecedented investment is pouring into the development of cleaner burning fuels, more energy efficient cars, renewable power sources like wind and solar, and even technologies further out on the horizon like geothermal and tidal power. And these are technologies that attempt to address those tensions that I mentioned in the beginning of these remarks, tensions between our desire for heat and light and mobility and our simultaneous desire to preserve our perfect places. And yet, even here, the trade-offs are legion. I'm only guessing here, but I would assume that no one's perfect place included a farm of wind turbines in the background somewhere, or a large solar array. Geothermal drilling has been associated with earthquakes. Certain forms of solar power production can use more than 1 billion gallons of precious water every year. What impact might tidal turbines have on fish or whale populations? And of course, even as the renewable power industry grows and diversifies, the reality is that we will continue to need and rely on fossil fuels for decades to come. And we will continue to face questions about how to deal with the impacts of those industries. And this is an important point. I think even if you believe that the carbon dioxide and other gases that arise from the production and combustion of fossil fuels don't contribute to global warming, it's hard to argue that they're not polluting in other ways. Whether it's coal ash or the release of sulfur and nitrogen oxides into the air, oil spills, the leaching of drilling fluids into the water table, these are all potential byproducts of industries that we still want and need as a society to give us our heat and our light and our mobility. How do we address those byproducts? How much are we willing to spend in doing so? It's easy to think that societies will, in time, sort out these questions. I've actually been working with the local conservancy in New York on a bit of an audio history of New York City's harbor, which, as you probably can imagine, was at one time one of the most polluted places on the planet. What had once been a rich and biologically diverse estuary, teeming with oysters and alive with any manner of fish, salt marshes that provided refuge for migrating songbirds, and reef lines and beaches full of barking harbor seals. There were harbor seals in New York. All of that had either disappeared or been poisoned by a combination of human and industrial waste, so that by the early 20th century, a public health committee report would describe New York as, quote, a body of land entirely surrounded by sewage. And yet today, conservationists point to New York's harbor, which is still bustling with industry and trade and commerce, bringing us our fuel and our televisions and the things that we demand, as a great environmental recovery story. Seals have actually begun to return. Fishermen angle for striped bass against the backdrop of the Empire State Building. Peregrine falcons and osprey make their homes in the girding of the Verrazano Bridge. Even oysters actually are slowly being reintroduced, though it may be some time before you see them in local restaurants. I definitely would not eat one. But what's important to note is that all these changes came about as a result of local, state, and federal governments, businesses and residents negotiating the tensions between the harbor's utility as a commercial avenue and its value as a living, breathing ecosystem. Of course, there are competing interests on all sides, and the odds almost always favor the status quo. But at some point, governments and businesses and individuals recognize, sometimes very reluctantly, that the status quo cannot be maintained, that certain environmental costs are accumulating, and that someone is going to have to take responsibility for those accumulated costs and include them in the balance sheet by which they measure their own success or failure. My guess is that this evolution won't be quick, and it certainly won't be pretty. And I'd also suggest that there will really be no end to the juggling act between our use of the planet and its preservation. Whether it's putting a price on carbon or drilling for natural gas, everything involves some sort of trade-off. I think that what's happening today is that we're slowly coming to realize that collectively we haven't really been taking responsibility for all of the costs. Whether and how quickly we'll decide who should shoulder what costs, of course, is an open question and a source of much debate. I think that's a good way now to circle back to Ray Anderson. And I'm going to close here with a couple of quotes from him. Mr. Anderson, as I mentioned before, is a well-heeled industrialist who made his fortune producing carpeting, a petroleum-intensive and often heavily polluting enterprise. But he has become famous, somewhat, for what he calls a spear in the chest, which he recently described to me as a realization some 14 years ago that there is a web of life and we are a part of it. We are not above it, and we are not outside of it. In a separate interview that I dug up from Mr. Anderson, he had this to say about externalities. We need an honest bottom line, he said. Today that bottom line is vastly subsidized. If any one of us were paying the full cost of oil, our bottom lines would be very different. If we somehow put a value on species extinction, and factor that into our costs, that bottom line would look very different. If we put any resource depletion into costs, our bottom line would change. What we have, he said, is a dishonest market that does not take into account all of the costs when it establishes prices. Mr. Anderson has famously set a goal for Interphase Carpet to eliminate not just its carbon footprint, but its entire impact on the environment by the year 2020. A goal that it says it's halfway now toward achieving by implementing such measures as recycling, mitigating waste, purchasing renewable power, and other measures. Will it ultimately achieve that goal? It's hard to say. Can every company, or for that matter, every country, realistically establish such aggressive targets? Can they afford to? I would guess probably not. Though that too is likely to be a matter of debate, depending on where you are. But what seems clear is that the sort of reckoning that Mr. Anderson describes is one that other businesses and governments and individuals will increasingly be forced to confront particularly as populations and economies continue to grow and expand and demand both a healthy planet and the conveniences of modern life. Two things that have been greatly at odds in our history. There is, after all, always a price to pay. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
We've got a wireless mic. If you just tell us your name and what you're studying, and we have a few minutes for questions. Any questions?
First of all, thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. I'm Nathaniel. I'm in computer science, and in terms of global warming, are you familiar with Rico's blanket? No. Okay. So there's a book, Superfreakonomics, and it kind of talks about it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So sulfur in the stratosphere. Yeah. So I don't know, like how. That's the only instance that I've heard about it. I haven't heard talk about it. I don't know if that's geoengineering. So I don't know if that has been looked at
as a possible solution.
Right.
I don't know particularly about that solution, but it's certainly, there are a large number of people who think that we will find a solution by some technological means, and we're kind of overreacting, or at least some of society is overreacting, because we tend to find those kind of places, whether it's shooting, sulfur into the air, or finding some kind of great vacuum cleaner that will slurp CO2 out of the atmosphere. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, if that's actually going to happen, and there are those things that we don't have time to wait. But they're certainly out there, and I do think that there's probably, am I doing that? I think that there's almost certain to be technological innovations that we haven't thought about yet. I mean, carbon capture is one that kind of comes up a lot. A lot of people think that's far-fetched and not likely to solve things. But I do think that technology is going to be a part of the solution.
My name's Kirk. I'm a geology major. What do you think is our personal responsibility as like an average person that enjoys modern conveniences yet wants to make a difference?
That's a good question. I mean, on almost any fund, I suppose we all have to say we should put our money where our mouth is and kind of do what we can for the environment if we believe that that's a worthwhile cause. If anything, I mean, I'm not somebody, I don't drive a Prius. I'd like to have one, but they're kind of expensive. But I do think that there are all kinds of things that we can do, even just as individuals. I mean, energy efficiency is probably one of the biggest ways that we could, if you're worried about carbon emissions, you can have a tremendous impact by just living a more energy efficient life. I don't know if you own a home, but certainly, if people were to insulate and people were to seal the drafts in their homes, for instance, that would have a tremendous impact on the amount of energy that's wasted. Take a bus rather than driving, or better yet, ride your bike if you can. All of these things are not practical in every situation, but I think to the extent that we are conscious of them and more people do it, that can have a tremendous impact. So if you're just looking for immediate things to do, that's a fine place to start. Sure.
Yeah, my name is Chip Oscarson. I teach in humanities. My question for you has to do with this notion of taking collective responsibility, because I think that and this is, it's very, I think this is right on, right? That we have to find a way to take collective responsibility. To come back to our example of our own state legislature here, that's passed this, this resolution, calling global warming, a hoax, and and everything else. Don't judge us by our legislature group.
New York's done crazy.
Yeah. Well, my point is this, though, that a lot of what we see going up in Salt Lake City, particularly this legislative session, is a reaction against what's perceived by a lot of very right-leaning politicians, a reaction against federal encroachment. And I mean, there's been all kinds of crazy things that if you look at, it's been part of the discussion up there. This is one of them. And it's the idea that we don't want the government coming in and telling us what we can or can't do. This has to do with our debates about wilderness here in the state. This has to do with our debates about energy consumption, about guns, about everything, right? And this really seems to mirror what's going on the international stage too. So the question is there a way to take collective responsibility without it basically being imposed by federal government, top down, or an international government, or something like this that that opposes it? I mean, what kinds of ideas have you heard? I mean, is there hope?
Well, gosh, it's such a complicated question, but my first reaction when I was listening to you ask the question was no. There is no way to really take collective action because we, as a society, we tend to act, individual actors are represented by governments, and that's how we end up taking large collective action. That's how we're set up. There is another side of the argument which I actually read this recently in the Wall Street Journal. This suggests, given that there's so much investment happening in renewable energy, for instance, right now, which is one of the only sectors that is really doing well, in the absence of a climate bill, in the absence of cap and trade legislation, maybe that's evidence that we don't, that we're already taking collective action and we don't need government to come in and impose that. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. That's one argument.
Yeah, it seems like in a lot of ways the market is precisely what's gotten us into this.
Right.
Because of the possibility of externalizing costs all the time.
Right. And so, that begs for some kind of oversight. I do think, though, that there are a lot of ways, one of the things that I was struck by in Copenhagen was the contingent of mayors who had actually been on hand there. And as a group, mayors from around the world, from cities around the world, have long been convinced that national governments will not act on this issue. And so they've been forging agreements among themselves to act on their own. And it seems to me that if the national level is not working, that going to the local level is another way, because after all, carbon emissions don't know legislative borders. I mean, it doesn't matter. So if Utah is not representing the kind of collective action that you'd like to see, then I would be willing to bet that you could find groups in Salt Lake City, perhaps, that would be willing to take some collective action. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't really know. You're shaking your head like I'm probably wrong, but
you're probably right.
I don't know the politics of Salt Lake City, but I do think that if more and more cities, for instance, were to introduce carbon restrictions, it's kind of the California model, right? Businesses don't want to manufacture to 6 different standards. So if there are myriad cities that have enacted carbon emissions limits, for instance, businesses will eventually fall in line without any kind of national action because it's cheaper for them to do so rather than try and do one thing here and another thing there. So that's one way, perhaps. Ground up. Let's few people. Anyone?
Hello? Okay. My name is Holly Wilson. I'm a journalism major. And so I was just wondering, when you're reporting on a controversial subject, it's really easy to have kind of a he said, she said sort of format, and I've read some of your articles, and it seems like you don't do that. And so how do you feel like it's worthwhile to acknowledge the skeptics and say the global warming there? How do you kind of find that balance of having different perspectives?
I'm sure that some of my articles have he said, she said elements. It's an easy kind of cover. I think that, on the issue of the climate skeptics, it's certainly worth hearing what they have to say. I don't think there's nearly as many of them as they would want you to believe. And I'm not sure, I'm not a scientist, first of all, so I'm not really qualified to assess their arguments. But at some point you do you do get a sense of, we're not going to debate whether or not gravity exists. We're not going to debate whether or not a whole host of scientific phenomena exist. Where I do think that we need to listen to the debate and the dissent and the kind of myriad points of view is on what exactly is likely to happen. If we accept that global warming is happening, we still don't have a lot of information on what that means for us. 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out. There's a lot of really rich debate and a lot of really kind of important science being done on that front. But it's inconclusive, it's uncertain, and to the extent that models are continuing to suss that out, and not all of them agree, we ought to cover that. So I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe I dodged it a little bit. I do think that there's, it's important to look for both sides. You just don't want to do that to a point of diminishing returns.
Son. My name is Walter Fazio. I'm a mechanical engineering major. And I was wanting to get your take on why climate change and perhaps environmentalism in general has become such a partisan issue in the United States. And maybe if you have time, whether there's any way out of that.
Yeah. Why it's become a partisan issue. I think some of that is probably, well, there are vested interests in ensuring that our use of fossil fuels continue. I mean, there's a lot of money, a lot of people make their livelihoods on fossil fuels, and that's a lot of big industrial money, a lot of old established money, and a lot of old established interests. And I'm probably not going out on a limb by suggesting that that influence and those desires tend to hew to one side of the political spectrum than the other. That could be part of it. I think it's, on some level, there are matters of faith involved. They're very hard to cut through and to make sense of. I mean, the use of the planet and its resources, I mean, there's a very strong sense that this was here put for us to do as we please. And so, and that slices down a certain political corridor too. But I also think that there's, on both sides of the political spectrum, there's a lot of heat and a lot of emotion. I also don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying those who truly believe in global warming have done a lot to hurt their own case by perhaps suggesting that things are more dire or more imminent than we actually know them to be. It could be right, but we don't have the scientific data to back that up right now. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's inherently a hot political issue just because it requires, anytime we're going to require massive change, that's what happens.
My name is York, and I'm studying public relations and international affairs. And my question is just, we talk about industrialized nations. The conflict really is, the desire for the welfare of the planet versus we want to drive our cars and we want this comfortable lifestyle. But when we talk about the less industrialized nations, the argument that I hear repeatedly, it's a matter of environmental conservation versus immediate sustenance. Like we need that to live today. And so it's, short-term benefit versus long-term gain. And so my question is, when we talk about the short-term support that these industrialized nations have agreed to, what is it that these less industrialized nations are thinking when they're thinking long-term support? And is that will really there on a national level for them to want to focus on the environmental conservation aspect of things?
Well, I think that their argument is actually can be really quite simple, which is, we didn't create this problem. The most immediate way for us to thrive is to burn these fossil fuels that we have at our disposal right now. We can't afford to build wind turbines. And we certainly can't afford to, shore up our infrastructure if the sea levels are going to swallow us up. So you guys did this to us in the industrialized world, and if you don't want us to burn fossil fuels as part of the global agreement, you're going to pay for us to do something else. I think that's pretty much what it boils down to. I do think, you kind of raise an issue that gives pause to the industrialized world, which is how do we ensure if we do put up this money, and I think that the number we're looking at is like $100 billion. If we do put up this money, how do we ensure that you're doing what you say you're going to do? How do we ensure you're not raising forests? How do we know that you're, we want to have the ability to come in and kind of monitor what you're doing. And of course, this was, people went round and round in Copenhagen over this issue. It was the big stumbling block because the industrializing countries said absolutely not. This is a question of sovereignty. We're not going to, certainly China was not going to agree to have U.S. environmental monitors on the ground there. So, are developing nations negotiating in good faith? I mean, that's a question I'm not sure that I can answer. I would just say we'd have to assume so. And the big challenge is if this money gets transferred, how do we transfer it? How do we make sure that it's being spent in the way that we hope it will be? And that is not even near being sorted out right now. Is that it?
Last question?
I've already asked.
You can be the last one.
Okay, so one more consideration. We realize that something like affecting global climate change and more so cultural attitudes on climate and like how much we should conserve and how much effort we should put in and how much we should lower our standard of living to accommodate the environment. It's going to be a multi-generational change. Like it's not going to happen in overnight or even 5 or 10 years. But one thing I sort of thought about is like we're kind of culturally indoctrinated by what we learn, and in the U.S. we have a public education system, which is a great place to learn about how awesome the U.S. is and a lot of other things that we're taught growing up. Do you think it would be feasible for there to be more of an attitude of awareness for environmental science and sort of environmental stewardship that's sort of taught in public schools, or some kind of commonly distributed method to, I guess, for future generations?
I think that's a fantastic idea. I think that it's happening on some level in some school districts. It's kind of funny, I know that at least one school district in New Jersey is learning about solar power, and the curriculum is partly sponsored by a solar company, which made a lot of people very uncomfortable. But I mean, I think that's a great idea. I mean, these changes in attitudes, if we collectively agree that these attitudes are important, are not going to take root without some kind of educational element. So, yes, I think that's a great idea.
Removing the barriers to that, we just need that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that there are tremendous barriers to it. It's more just kind of a poverty of imagination in a lot of ways.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.